You will remember the mid-2000s were not great. 2007-ish, it started to get pretty bad. There was recessions, foreclosures happening through the United States, and similar challenges happening up here. I remember it keenly because I had graduated at arguably the worst time to graduate in the previous 20 years, and there was no jobs to be found anywhere. In 2010, somebody came out with a book, a little bit in response to this. It was called The Book of Awesome. Do any of you remember this? Did any of you buy it? The Book of Awesome hit the bestseller list in 2010 and stayed there for 142 weeks consecutively. It celebrated, amongst all of the weariness that people were feeling, thousands of awesome little things we could all appreciate. Famously, he had an entire chapter about the satisfaction one gets by popping bubble wrap. He had a short entry on the beauty of fresh baked bread and how much we love that. And its popularity at the time was huge. It speaks to this sort of deep desire we have to feel a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, with the recognition that sometimes being surprised feels good. And so we continue reading the Gospel of Luke in Advent. You want to notice the awe and the surprise and think about how it relates to praising. And we hear the story every Christmas, and we become so familiar with all of the things in it that we tend to lose the awe and the wonder. Like most of us don't appreciate what it means to have running water in our house, but go anywhere where you don't have it and you'll come home and be grateful and think, how does this system work? I don't even know how it works, but man, I'm happy that it does, right? This morning we see Zechariah and Elizabeth. They are these righteous, law-abiding Jews, this elderly couple that have become pregnant at an older age. Their child has been given to them, and the response, the proper Jewish response, was to wait 8 days and then to have a circumcision and a naming process. It's a minor detail, but it's important to recognize how Luke, Acts, these books work together, because it reminds us of the stories from the Old Testament. If you go to Genesis 17, circumcision is instituted as this sign of an eternal covenant between God and Abraham. Even as virtually every other identity marker came to be debated among the Jews in antiquity, circumcision remained non-negotiable. It was like the one thing they could all agree. Like Christians, what do we all agree needs to happen, right? Maybe baptism or something. It's a reminder that Zechariah and Elizabeth and all the people in the story are real people with real customs, a real history, real beliefs, real expectations. When he sings the song of Zechariah will sing, he makes explicit mention of this. It's hard for us to see it, but he says in John, the world will meet the great covenantal blessings. And he's referring back to that story in Genesis. He's saying, I believe what's happening in my family relates back a couple thousand years. In fact, the whole story of barrenness and having a baby later in life might remind us of Abraham and Sarah. Right? They have their son, Isaac, late. It's a trope that happens over and over again. Whenever in the Bible you see barren woman, you know God's going to make a change in a little while. It's working nicely. God at work in the salvation of his people, his restoration of all of creation through regular people like you and I. Now, the people in the story, they all assume that the child is going to be named Zechariah. That's the custom. The eldest child is supposed to be called Junior. I remember when we had Oliver, I had a couple of friends from Africa, and they couldn't understand the whole having fun thinking about what the name of the child could be. You know, Mary and I were endlessly back and forth. What are we going to name them? What are we going to? And they were like, what are you talking about? It's obviously Junior. Like, they just didn't understand how this was even remotely negotiable. And so then you go forward and they all make the assumption in the story, this is obviously Zechariah Jr., and we move on, right? And then Elizabeth does the very unwomanly thing of actually speaking up and contradicting this. She corrects the people around her and gives the name other than Zechariah, right? This is kind of minor league shocking for the people around. People think they must ask Zechariah because who listens to women? And especially when they make no sense, And he said, they all think he's going to be Junior, right? Then Zechariah surprises them. And he says, no, actually, I agree with my wife, called John. And for all the men in the room, you know this, happy wife, happy life. If she wants him to be named John, you name the kid John, move on. We know as readers, they're doing this in obedience to God, right? God has asked them to do this, and they are going to do exactly what he asked them because they see the whole process of her being pregnant and having a child as this amazing gift from God. The name John actually translates something like Yahweh has given grace. Like the name itself means we believe this child is a gift from God. They tie the name of the baby to God's grace. They're not shy about what they think is happening in their lives. They believe God is literally working in their family. And that is a pretty astonishing claim. If somebody you know has a baby and they say God is clearly at work in this child, for the most part, we would stand there and think that's really a bold claim to make. I wonder what outcomes in your own lives would really astonish you the way these two are astonished to have a child. Astonishment comes with expectations. We have preconceived ideas, like the people. They knew the name was going to be Zechariah, and they are astonished when the name is not Zechariah. Our expectations being met so often leads us to struggle to feel awe, because we already know what's going to happen. I was trying to think of what would be the most awesome kind of awe moments we might have had that we've forgotten about. For me, I don't remember the first time I had hot chocolate, but I bet I thought this was the greatest drink in the history of the world. What might surprise you to make you feel like that again? What might make you stand in awe? If you live in Ottawa, the bus being on time might be a small one. If you have a spouse, them bringing you coffee after a fight might be a good one. Child calling home out of the blue over the holidays. Like, when was the last time you were really surprised? It's a sneaky question. Like, it's hard to think of when you've been surprised. I was surprised not too long ago. Sometime in November, I bought new shoes. I had these hiking boots, and they're brown, and I have a black belt. And somebody said, you can't wear brown shoes with a black belt. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't know anything about this. And so I Google it, because that's what you do. And it turns out that's true. Like, you're supposed to have your belt and your shoes. Much of you already know this, but I didn't know. So I was thinking, do I have to buy a new belt just because I bought shoes? Like, I don't want to. And then I was reading a book about minimalism, and it had this whole story about how all this stuff is supposed to match, but you cannot really worry about it. Like, a real minimalist wouldn't care if their boots matched their belt. And in that moment, I felt like God was winking at me. Like, it was just, like, it wasn't the author, it was just this cosmic, you don't need to buy a brown belt, you're gonna be okay with a black one. And I was surprised by this sense, like, you can't fabricate these moments, they just come. To see God at work in the world, you have to stand ready to be in awe or surprise, not be cynical, not think you can explain everything away, but rather to see God sometimes mysteriously working. And it takes intention to allow ourselves to notice that, to even notice if we're feeling awe. A goofy example for you. I am astonished when I order a latte and the milk is in a shape. Like, if they can make a tree or whatever they make in the top of the coffee cup, I'm amazed that could be made. I have no idea how to do that. I don't think God has a lot in that moment, but practicing, observing things that surprise you is helpful. We might notice the blue of a robin's egg if you have ever seen that, or famously the color purple, right? We know this book from the late 80s where it says, I think it pisses God off every time you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it. But we often forget in that passage, or maybe we don't know because we didn't read the book, it's part of a longer discourse about God. And it goes way deeper than just noticing the color purple. It's about understanding the character of God through the noticing. So the scene keeps going. So it's Sally and Shug, and their passage continues. It says, what'd it do when it pissed off, I asked. Oh, it makes something else. People think pleasing God is all God cares about. But any fool living in the world can see it always trying to please us back. Yeah, I say. Yeah, she say. It always making little surprises and springing them on us when we least expect. You mean it wants to be loved just like the Bible say? Yes, Sally, she say. Everything want to be loved. The paying attention, noticing these little details that can make us happy is not about making us happy. It's about making us closer to God. Slowing down, letting awe, like the color purple or whatever you see that brings you awe, can bring your attention to the idea that God desires a relationship with you. God is trying to get a hold of you, trying to reach out to you in some way. When you look in awe and surprise and wonder, there's a way of understanding this that you're in the moment having a love song from God. It changes the image you carry of God for some people. If you think of God as this wrathful judge and angry and yada, 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 what do you think of when you think he's the one that made your coffee look so nice today? Paying attention. Paying attention for where you see something out of the ordinary. Sometimes this helps us remove our weariness. Like the Book of Awesome being that popular is not a surprise at that exact moment. People were tired. They needed something hopeful, and it had to be really affordable, so popping bubble wrap would do. Noticing the divine takes some of the load off. Now, one of the people I like to watch on YouTube, he's this funny guy. He lives in a tiny cabin in Sweden. And he's not Christian or anything, but he's like off the grid, and it's really hard and whatever. And he makes these really slow, beautiful movies. And one day he goes, and he's had this really long day, and he's going outside to go to the washroom and bathe in like a frozen creek that he has to like chop the ice to clear. Like it's quite the life he lives. But while he's doing it, he looks up, and for the first time in his life, the entire sky is lit up with the northern lights, and he just stands there in awe. And then the video just cuts to like 10 minutes of these northern lights, and you can just feel the weight of the day coming off. There are things that happen in the world. Some of us, it's sunrises, some of us, it's sunsets, some of us, it's the ocean, that just bring us awe and reverence closer to God. They make us grateful. So the question, I think, is if there's awesome stuff all the time, if God's actually constantly doing this to us and trying to reach out to us, why do we so often fail to notice? Partly the answer is the world's not the way it's supposed to be, right? You go back to Genesis, we're all broken and sinful, and thus we're going to miss obvious things. But also, as we get older, we feel silly if we lean into joyful and astonishing things. They are less smart. They are less sophisticated. We are trained not to feel awe, or at the very least, not to show it. Like little kids show their excitement about all kinds of stuff. Like the most inane things bring them excitement. On my way here, there was a lady, and she had a kid on Byron, and it was like this tall, and it was hiding behind a tree, and she was going on one side of the tree, and he was cackling, and then she'd go on the other side, and he was cackling. Like it's nothing. And yet the kid is in absolute joy. We don't let stuff like that bring us joy. It would make us look too silly for the most part. Like, what if you're amazed by something and other people are like, oh yeah, that's really simple, that happens all the time? Then you feel dumb, right? And then people start to look at you like you're simple, or you're whatever, because you're taking joy in things that everybody else just accepts as regular. And when we do that, what we're doing is we rob ourselves of joy, and we rob ourselves of this ability to connect to God, who's reaching out to us in these moments. Like the great chocolate you're going to have in the next week, like take a moment and enjoy it. Moments of lightness. And when we do that, we connect with other people. People who do this, who live joyously, who enjoy these little moments, are very attractive to us. We love to be near them. I knew a guy, he actually recently passed away. His name was Matthew John, and he grew up in an orphanage in India. And it was very difficult, and there was not a lot of food. And so eventually in the 70s, he moved to Canada, and he started a new orphanage, and he always raising money and sending money back. But one thing he always did, he was the guy at church that had candy in his pockets at all times. And every kid in our church loved Matthew John because he would give them candy. It's very simple. You give them candy, they like you. We moved here, and he starts sending us checks in the mail to buy our kids candy from Bulk Barn every time there's an excuse that you could possibly buy a child candy, because he knows kids like candy. And he's got people all around the world he's sending $20 to here and there to buy candy. And on one level, you think this is the simplest, most ridiculous little thing. And yet, you go to town with Matthew John and you walk around, and literally everybody's waving, smiling. Everybody knows him. Everybody likes him. But he's just taking joy in the simple pleasure of very cheap candy. You're not born that way. He's not born that way. He's intentional. He's noticing this is something that brings joy, and I'm going to do it. Even when bad stuff was happening in his life, he continued to do that. Moments of resonance, whether things are good or bad. Moments where you say to yourself, look, there's something happening here and it matters. Like the feeling of the child hoping Santa's going to come. Or if you're a parent, if you ever got your kid the perfect gift, and you're just like, oh, this is like perfect. Or if your kid's struggling to make friends, and then you see them actually make a friend, and you're like, oh, something's happening here. It matters. You slow down, take a minute, notice. Moments of awe can be divine. When we see God at work, then we can give praise and we can give thanks. So in Luke, Elizabeth's relatives and neighbors, they rejoice when John is born. The Greek word for rejoice here is sukcharo. It means to celebrate God's grace together, to share in someone else's joy. Then when Zechariah's voice returns, he rejoices and he praises God through singing. And in the story, you can see there's this ripple effect of the joy. It just vibrates outwards when it gets shared. Joy and amazement are all through Luke's gospel if you take the time to read it. At the very beginning, you have the neighbors in the Judean hill country at John's birth, everyone in Bethlehem who hears the shepherds speak of good news, Mary and Joseph after they receive Simeon's blessing in the temple, and it goes on and on. So many instances in the opening chapters when we presume the characters are filled with wonder, with awe, with astonishment. They are amazed. And what do? They praise God for it. Why does Luke's story emphasize this so much? The answer, of course, is that we can all stand surprised. We can all stand amazed. We can all stand with awe that God would send his son into the world. It's a story we are so familiar with that we lose the awe, we lose the wonder of that. But if you want to be really joyous, if you want to be really praising, you have to find a way to hold on to that awe. The idea that God loves you so much that he would send his son in an effort to connect with you. Don't lose sight of that. It's not a small thing. No other religion claims this. If we can grab the awe of that, we stand in wonder and we can stand in praise with Zechariah and Elizabeth, with Mary and the crowds, with tongues that will witness to others. When we sing the hymns and the carols, we'll sing them with a sort of joy and awe and wonder, and other people will say, why? And that's our chance to tell them. I pray that God would help us to do that God would help us to feel awe and wonder and joy and share that with others, to let it ripple out in our lives throughout the holiday season. Amen.